Hi, welcome to session 9 of History 3380 World Civilizations. In this session, we're going to be looking at modernity. Now, we've looked at the rise of modern societies in Europe, roughly from 1500 to, let's say, 1800, and some of the characteristics that constituted modernity, like the rise of capitalism, particularly in the form of industrial capitalism at this time, the emergence of rationalist thought processes, the emphasis on rational thought to analyze both the physical world as well as problems in human societies, secularism, the effort to divide between the spiritual world and the physical world and treat them as two separate entities, and a set of ideas about the human individual, the rights of the individual. We see that, of course, in the French Revolution and elsewhere. But what we're going to look at now are problems with modernity in two formats. If we go to the first slide, it talks about old and new modernity in this first slide. And what I mean by that is we're going to look at problems with modernity both in societies that became modern back in the period before 1800, and then societies which in the late 19th and into the 20th century tried to rapidly become modern. Specifically, what we're going to look at is Germany and Japan as societies that modernized fairly early. Japan was a bit behind the West in terms of when it developed a modern capitalist society, but not that far behind. And on the other hand, societies that tried to modernize much later, really at the end of the 19th and through the first part of the 20th century. And we're going to see the kinds of problems that arise. In fact, when we look at Germany and Japan, what we're going to see is the emergence of fascism as a 20th century phenomenon. Totalitarian regimes in the form of fascist regimes, and I'll talk about what fascism is in a little while. What's important here is that what happened in Germany and Japan is that, yes, modern societies emerged, but they emerged in societies which had highly repressive social systems, particularly the way people who worked on a day-to-day basis were treated, meaning peasants and working class people. That environment created substantial problems for these societies as they modernized, and we'll see what those problems were, and they helped lead to the rise of fascism in the early decades of the 20th century. And in the second half of the session, we're going to look at countries that try to modernize rapidly, Russia and China. And in these cases, what we have are autocratic states, in other words, regimes that are, we might describe them as dictatorial or autocratic, the Tsarist regime, the old dynasty in Russia. We have these autocratic states trying to rapidly push their countries into modernity, and there what we get are radical reactions against that process, and in both instances we wind up with communist revolutions and the creation of communist societies. So we're going to look at these two examples of sort of old modernity and problems that arose in societies even though they modernized relatively early, and then a different set of problems that emerged for societies that tried to rapidly modernize, and leading in those cases to the rise of communist societies. Now, before we get into the specific instances of these types of societies, these two different courses that they pursued and the outcomes that led to, we want to talk about some of the challenges to modernity. As societies modernized, as they went along this road of capitalist development and the development of rationalist thought and development of secular institutions, etc., not everyone embraced this process of change. Most people, certainly in Western societies by the beginning of the 20th century, would say, oh yes, we embrace modernity. We take pride in the fact that we are among the first truly modern societies. But that doesn't mean the process wasn't without significant challenge and conflict. One of the major conflicts was class conflict. Inevitably, what happened with the rise of industrial capitalism was the emergence of large wage-earning urban working classes this had never existed in human societies before. Sure, people worked in cities, and some people worked for daily pay, but the idea that you worked in an industrial plant and were subject to the disciplines and the rigors of industrial capitalism. Got to be there by 6 in the morning, you work to 6 at night, you have to work and use this machine, the machine sort of tells you what to do. That had never happened before, and certainly there had never been a working class on the scale that now existed in modern societies, where millions of people were laboring in industrial plants in urban centers in the West. Often people felt deeply exploited, low wages, mistreatment. And even if those conditions hadn't existed, the simple fact is they had been uprooted from the old ways of life that had existed before this time. As I talked about before, where nature sort of set the pace of daily life, that was no longer the case. Now the corporate manager set the pace of your life. And the idea of families working together in agricultural settings, that was largely a past memory for urban working people by the middle of the 19th century. That's not to say that what they had in the past was any way ideal. It's simply that this was a radical shift, and many people challenged that. A number of these movements coalesced around the ideas of Karl Marx, or what's known as Marxism. Marx argued that industrial capitalism was inherently unjust and doomed to be toppled in revolutionary upheavals. He essentially argued that what industrial capitalists did was to siphon off the value created by workers and take that for themselves to profit from the labor of others. He also argued that over time, more and more people, even those who counted themselves among the middle class, would be driven into the proletariat or into the working class, helping set the stage for a proletarian revolution, a mass uprising by the working class. Most of all, what Marx said about capitalism was that it was dehumanizing. And many people, whether they accepted Marx or not, could sympathize with that idea. Marx's basic argument, the one that's most important and often overlooked, was that the way that people become truly human is through work. That creative process is what makes us fully human, when we realize ourselves through work. You have ideas, you develop an idea, you know, this is a piece of art that I want to create. I want to build a better automobile. I want to plant flowers that'll be the most beautiful in the world. Through all kinds of diverse activities that are work, people can find fulfillment, express themselves, be creative. And Marx said that's the problem with industrial capitalism. It strips that away, because it takes most people and puts them into basically assembly line positions where they simply go out in a regimented fashion and do the same task over and over again. And this certainly was a common complaint among the industrial working class. Sitting at an assembly line all day and engaging in the same repetitive motion. You can do the same thing, of course, in an office today. It's called a computer station. We get, repetitive nerve syndrome. That's what Marx was talking about, that this is mind-numbing, it's dehumanizing. So beyond his grander ideas about what might happen to capitalism was his fundamental idea that had widespread appeal. It was that capitalism was dehumanizing. So this provided a political philosophy and ideology that served to inspire a number of political movements in Europe, and indeed, as we will see, around the world, in the second half of the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. But it wasn't just problems of class conflict within societies, modern societies, and the challenges of Marxism. There were other issues as well. One of the basic assumptions about modernity, a basic assumption that people who live in modern societies have, is that they have now unlocked the secrets of the universe. Maybe not all of them, but we're on the way. We all, in modern societies, put enormous faith in science, that scientists will find answers to problems. And they're able to create such extraordinary, productive processes. Just think of the computer age, the industrial age before that. And they're able to understand such complex developments in the natural world. Think of modern medicine. So people in modern societies often have great confidence. It's sort of, in fact, a given. They do have great confidence in the ability of modern science, modern technology, to solve the problems of the world. That now, instead of being, simple victims of nature, like people in the 14th century wondering why millions of them were dying in the Black Death, now we can understand such frightening phenomena and actually master and control them. However, by the first part of the 20th century, some of those ideas were getting a serious challenge. During World War I, where modern technologies were used in the form of barbed wire, tanks, poison gas, machine guns, long-range artillery, modern technology left about 20 million people dead. And not surprisingly, many people, as a result of World War I, began questioning the wisdom of modern science and technology. If you'll notice, in Hollywood, for example, after World War I, the proliferation of movies about Frankenstein and so forth, the idea of the mad scientist. These were reflections of the concerns of contemporary people. The story itself may have been written back in the 18th century, but it had a very contemporary concern for people in the early part of the 20th century after having seen the enormous destruction that could be inflicted upon mankind by its own technology. Flipping the coin, after World War I, the great influenza epidemic, we talked about earlier in the course, swept around the world in 1919. Estimates may be as many as 50 million people dead. Maybe as many as 20, 25 million died in India alone. We'll never know for sure. People were dying so fast there was no way of having structured systems that would keep accurate tallies. Nor could we be sure that all these people that died at any given time died of the flu, but the numbers were staggering. And yet here, we have modern science addressing this issue and completely unable to solve the crisis. Why is this strain of influenza, and influenza, as we've seen, was hardly a unique phenomena in human medical history. Why was this strain of the disease so devastating? They never found out. And how do you prevent it? Never found out. Don't know today. How they might prevent such a pandemic from occurring again in a case of something like influenza. So the First World War brought both these images of how modern science that was supposed to be so helpful to humanity could be extraordinarily destructive. And it also brought images of the seeming helplessness of modern science to solve the problems such as the pandemic that occurred in 1919. This kind of issue continues to haunt modern society today. Think of the movie Titanic, which has been remade about 50 times. Why does it have such a compelling attraction for people? Other than the fact that Leonardo DiCaprio was so cute when he was 50 pounds lighter, 10 years younger. Now, what's the attraction? You might say. It's because it's this same story, that here is this creation of humanity. Modern man has created this indestructible vessel, and then one iceberg and it's gone. It's not like that many people died on the Titanic. 10 times that many people die in violent acts every day around the world. It wasn't that. It was the idea that here is science and technology creating this supposedly indestructible vessel, and then nature comes along and destroys it in a heartbeat. It's that kind of issue that troubled modern societies as well, because now instead of thinking, well, gee, we're in control of the physical world and we can solve its problems, etc., now people once again are thinking, maybe our lives and human societies in general are a lot more fragile than we thought. And maybe these tools of science and rational thought that we believed were so powerful aren't necessarily. Added to this, of course, were the economic depressions that struck the world in 1919 and 1929. The 1929 depression in particular, which is the one that is most widely remembered because it was so massive, reduced industrial output around the world by 1/3, reduced international commerce by 2/3. And those numbers are absolutely staggering. The idea that it would actually decline by that much, and that's like in the first 5 years after the Depression began in 1929. It's absolutely incredible. And many people believe that the capitalist world was going to collapse completely, that it just couldn't sustain itself any longer, not after these extraordinary losses. And these weren't the only problems. There are other issues raised by science itself. People like Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, because Freud's emphasis was on the irrational mind, the unconscious mind, the fact that people often act on unconscious and irrational impulses. We do things that don't make sense. You're rushing to work in the morning, you go out and you're pulling out of your driveway and you discover you got a flat tire, you have a vitally important meeting to get to, you jump out, see the tire, grab the lug wrench, and begin beating the car. Is that a rational response? No. It's an emotional, unconscious response, just venting your fury. But if that's the way human beings really are, that we operate with this vast unconscious mind stream that influences our behavior, then how can we really be sure that our conscious minds, our rational minds, can really control the universe around us? So all of these issues were arising, leading to serious doubts about modernity and whether it was really all that it was cracked up to be. Could science really control the natural world? Were we really headed for a future of unending prosperity under capitalism? What about the enormous damage that modern technology could inflict on human beings? In the midst of all of these issues, certain countries with what I'll call repressive pasts experience these same developments, these same doubts about the process of modernization. And they led to extreme outcomes. Germany is the first one we're going to look at in that regard. Now, if we go way back for a moment to the Black Death, stalking Europe, and decimating much of the population. That phenomena, the decline in population that occurred in Europe in the 14th century and into the 15th, created problems for landowners in what we call now modern Germany. A scarcity of labor. What they began doing is attracting peasants from other areas within Germany where there were more substantial population survivals, offering them free land. But then as time went on, once they had the peasants settled on the land, they turned around and began enserfing them, subjugating them to essentially a condition of slavery in the 15th and 16th centuries. So while in other parts of Europe, the Black Death was sort of a liberating experience in the sense that those peasants who survived had greater opportunities in terms of working their own land or making better deals with landowners. In Germany, that process was actually reversed, and peasants actually suffered a further subordination to the landowners. They became serfs in the 15th and 16th centuries. So we've got this very repressive system in place by the 16th century. And as a result of that, Germany suffers a massive peasant uprising called the Bauernkrieg in 1524. Peasants rising up against these repressive conditions. Now, the Bauernkrieg was crushed by the landowners and the nobility. Peasants were slaughtered, and they were resubjugated. But what that meant was that Germany was going to now enter the modern world with a highly repressive social system. By the 19th century, the two key groups in Germany in terms of the economy were people called Junkers, which is just a term for large landowners, and industrialists. Germany was rapidly industrializing. But in Germany, unlike other parts of the West, it was the landowners who remained dominant politically, who controlled the political system and the social environment, and who continued to insist on preserving this highly repressive social system. As one historian said, you might imagine it as if in the United States, in the Civil War, the South, rather than the North, had won. Yes, you'd still have industrial capitalism, but you'd also still have a highly repressive labor system of slavery. You know, that's kind of what happened in Germany in very simplistic terms. Under the German emperor or king, the Kaiser, this system meant that there were limited internal markets. And what that means is simply this, that if peasants are indeed being crushed under the heels of the landowners, and they are essentially serfs, those people, which constitute the largest portion of the population, are not in the market economy. If you're a serf or a slave, which is what you basically are, you're not going to be out there buying stuff. You're lucky to get enough just to subsist. Contrast that for a moment with the United States in the 19th century, where the United States had millions of small farmers who bought fertilizer and tools and then, larger instruments such as automated plows, etc., barbed wire. These people created an enormous market, and then the utensils for their homes, etc., because they were in the market economy, so they were an enormous market for rising industry. There was a big internal market. But in Germany, that's not the case, even though Germany is building this industrial powerhouse. What that means is Germany is going to be inclined more towards an aggressive foreign policy, because it really needs those markets more than any other country. Yeah, sure, England and France were looking for external markets too. But more than any other country, Germany needed those external markets because its own internal market was so small. So what you get is this autocratic state, a repressed social system, on top of which has been built a modern industrial economy. But an industrial economy which lacks a sufficient internal market. that aggressive policy, stimulated by the lack of sufficient internal markets, helped bring on World War I. And of course, the war proved to be catastrophic for Germany. Germany is defeated in the war. The Kaiser's regime collapses. One of the first of a series of terrible blows that Germany would suffer in the matter of only 2 decades. In the ensuing chaos that followed World War I, there was a small group in Germany of communists called the Spartacus League who attempted to seize control of the government in 1919, what was called the Spartacus Rebellion. Now, the odds of this ever succeeding were nil, but for many Germans, it was an extraordinarily frightening experience to go from the autocratic regime of the Kaiser to even the distant possibility of a communist revolution. And then comes the World Depression that followed on World War I, because demand for goods was collapsing around the world at the end of the war. This enormous built-up wartime demand for products disappeared, and before the world economy could reset itself to function on a peacetime level, the world plunged into the first of the 2 Great Depressions in this era. Now, as if war, the potential of communist revolution, and then a depression weren't enough, Germany now experienced hyperinflation, runaway inflation. Not inflation that is, well, gee, 10%, 20, 30, 40, 50, not even 100, not even 200%, not even 300 or 500%, but 1,000, 2,000, 4,000, 5,000, 10,000% inflation. People would get paid in Germany. They would rush outside with their paycheck to find agents waiting who would exchange their check for German marks. And then they would go spend the entire check immediately. Not because they were spendthrifts, but because they knew within a couple of days the marks that they got would be worthless anyways. And if inflation is 10,000% in a year, how much is your money worth? Particularly devastating, not only for the working class, but for the middle class. If there's one thing that characterizes middle class people, at least in most of the world, maybe not here, but even here, although we don't quite emphasize it, but middle class people are savers. They save money. It may be in the form of buying a house, educational accounts for their children, retirement accounts, but that's what the middle class life is about. It's saving money for those things that you want: a home, a car, an education for your children, retirement. And Germans were very much that way. In fact, Germans, even back in this period, were absolutely appalled by the way that Americans indebted themselves by buying things on time, etc. I just couldn't imagine it, even today. If you told Germans how much money the average American is carrying on their credit card, they'd be absolutely astonished. And now, what has happened to all those bank accounts for these careful German middle-class people? They've evaporated. If you had 10,000 marks in the bank and inflation was 10,000% this year, you have 0 marks in the bank now because those marks don't have any value. It's been completely wiped out by inflation. The roller coaster ride continues when the world plunges into the Great Depression in 1929. Now, there are logical explanations why all of this happened. Defeat in the war, the Great Depression, the depression that followed in 1919. Hyperinflation was largely explained by the fact that Germany had to pay off huge war reparations while trying to rebuild its economy, so the government borrowed and spent profusely to pay off those war reparations, the penalties that the Allies were collecting, and to try to get the economy running again. Well, when the government starts spending money hand over fist, it triggers inflation. And the Great Depression is explainable in part by the fact that there was rapid overproduction, particularly of primary goods in the world's economies, because of the application of new industrial processes. There was simply oversupply of products. There was also a crisis in the financial sector involving Germany's war debt. So all of this is explainable. But of course, how much do those explanations mean to people who have lost their life savings, who are never going to own that home that they've dreamed of for years, whose children will never get that education that they had promised them? It's not surprising that the middle class largely abandoned the ideas of democracy and had serious doubts about capitalism. After all, after the war, a democratic government had been set up in Germany. And so far, under that democratic government, Germans had experienced a depression, hyperinflation, and another depression. Not a great track record. Not surprisingly, people might entertain other possibilities than democracy as political means for solving their problems. And as far as capitalism goes, well, by the time the Great Depression hit in 1929, it wasn't just Germans who were beginning to wonder whether really capitalism had a place in the world anymore. It's into this environment that Hitler and the Nazis enter. Now, Nazism, or National Socialism, was what we term fascism. Explaining what fascism is a little bit difficult. And about the easiest way is to describe simply some of its characteristics. One underlying characteristic is irrationalism. Another, racism. And a third, totalitarianism. What do I mean by irrationalism? Modernity had been typified by rationalist thought. That by rational analysis, scientific analysis, rational discourse, we can come to understand the world around us, whether it's the social world, the physical world, etc. Irrationalism throws that out the window and makes appeals to people's emotions, no matter how irrational its explanations may be. During Hitler's regime in Germany, people were summoned to the city of Nuremberg, where a great stadium had been built, for what were called the Nuremberg events. And these events would involve tens of thousands of people marching at night with flags and torches, and Hitler standing on this vast balcony addressing them in emotional terms. A little book burning. Bands playing martial music. And the whole idea was to appeal to people's sense of tribalism. And I mean it in this form. the idea that people feel secure in a group. We sometimes call it a mob mentality. That if you're with a group of people, you're not afraid, right? Because there are a group of people with you. When you were a kid, you know, if there was somebody down the block who used to beat you up, well, if you got a couple of your friends and walked down the block, then you'd feel more secure because there's a bunch of us together, so we're okay. The idea that you belong to some innate group that makes you stronger, that empowers you. And that's what the Nuremberg events appeal to give people a sense of belonging to this great, invincible force. Did it make any sense? No. But people could feel that. You know, in a small way, think of it in these terms. When people go to a sporting event, like a football game, you know, and they're all in the crowd and they're yelling and so forth, and you look around and, you know, most of these people, are they athletes? Not really. Are they capable of doing the kinds of things that the team is doing down the field? No. But they're identifying, they're bonding with the team, they're bonding with each other. They're part of this great mass. And what does it mean to be, you know, we're part of the Houston Texans fan base. So? Who are the Houston Texans? A bunch of guys from all over the country who get paid millions of dollars to come here and work. And who will be shipped off somewhere else the minute the contract goes into free agency. Yeah, but we're all part of the same group. Sure, whatever. Same irrational thinking underlines the ideas of the Nuremberg events, that you're part of this great invincible mass. And specifically, that invincible mass was defined in a racial form, that you're part of the great Aryan race, this, what Hitler would argue, founding race of the German nation. A race which is superior to all others in the world, even other white groups, because, for example, he looked down upon Slavic people who were also white, but to him they were inferior because supposedly they weren't part of the superior Aryan race. So he takes Western racism and moves it up a notch. You know, it's not even just people of color; it's anybody that's not an Aryan. And then finally, this movement will find expression in a totalitarian state. As Hitler so often said, "Un Volk, un Reich, un Führer." One people, one state, one leader. Total control from the top. And here, too, was deep-rooted irrationalism. Because the justification for this totalitarian state was simply this, that Hitler, as the leader, knew the will of the German people innately. His decisions, whether to close down the legislature, impose dictatorship, go to war, he didn't need to consult the German people. He didn't need to hold a vote because he could read the minds of the German people. He knew their will, and he became the instrument of it. These are the basic elements in fascism. In many ways, a contradiction of some of the basic principles of modern societies, turning towards racism, irrationalism, emotional explanation. Although, on the other hand, totalitarianism, as we've seen, also has its roots in modernity. Looking back to the French Revolution and the ideas of the terror, the absolute powers of the state. And indeed, fascism was always a combination of anti-modern and modern. One other element in this new environment the fascists were creating was a command economy, based particularly on the idea of scarcity. The basic understanding in industrial capitalism was that industrial capitalism had extraordinary productive powers. So if anything, the problem would be, as it had been in 1919 and 1929, was overproduction, too much stuff. But of course, for Germans, they had suffered one set of deprivations after another. Between the war, hyperinflation, depression. The economic philosophy of the fascists was that what we therefore have to do is have state control of the economy. It's still going to be a capitalist economy, but now it'll be controlled by the state, so that the state can allocate scarce resources. We should keep this in mind, because later when we talk about the United States and its ideas of modernity, they're quite different, because in the United States the idea is, oh no, what we plan to do is provide this sort of cornucopia of consumer goods, that there'll be plenty of stuff for everybody. In Germany, the idea was, look, it's not going to be enough, so the state has to make these basic decisions on how economic resources will be allocated. As I just suggested, fascism was always a blending of the modern and the anti-modern. And more than that, a blend between the traditional and the modern. The basic promise that the fascists were making to people in Germany was that they could have the material well-being of modern industrial society, but avoid all those unpleasant aspects of modernity, like class conflict. We're not going to have any more class conflict. We're going to close down the political parties. We'll shoot labor leaders. There won't be any class conflict. Everyone will get along. It'll be just like the good old days before there was a working class. The creation of the Hitler Youth Corps was a part of this same idea. The Hitler Youth Corps was sort of, the fascist version of the Boy Scouts. These little blonde Aryan boys would be taken off to camp and go through drills, part of it training for the military in the future. But more than that, the idea was that they were to represent perfect physical specimens of young Aryans, and more than that, perfect young Aryan males. This was to be the ideal of German society. Young males who would be strong and aggressive, and at the same time carry out the traditional role of a man. Not only as warrior, but as husband, father, provider. That's what these young men were preparing for. Now, of course, if they were going to do that, they needed appropriate mates. And to provide them, the Nazis created the faith and beauty movement for young women. You notice there's nothing about intelligence here, because they're not worried about that. You don't have to be smart. You just have to have faith in the fascist system and be attractive. Therefore, you'll be able to fulfill your role as wife and mother. So we will ensure the preservation of the traditional family unit, even as we continue to build our modern industrial society. We'll get rid of class conflict, we'll preserve the traditional family, and we'll avoid those frightening movements that challenge all of this, such as feminism. In Germany in the 1920s, women had been very involved in the modern economy, going out, finding jobs, engaging in cultural activities that were considered very modern, going out to nightclubs on their own, smoking. All right, that's enough of that stuff. Women were to follow a traditional role. So the appeal of fascism was, look at the fascists say, we know just how frightening modernity really is. Look what's happened to us between 1919 and 1929. We can solve all that. You can still have the material prosperity brought by industrial capitalism, assured by a command economy. At the same time, we can avoid all those nasty aspects of modernity, like class conflict and the breakup of traditional families. We can put the two pieces together. Now, of course, this may require, and does require, a totalitarian state to do it. But, hey, that's the price of progress. So this is the great appeal. In this state, a society that had been pounded by enormous setbacks, from defeat in war to depression, hyperinflation, the fascists offered both modernity and the comforts of traditional society, guaranteed by a totalitarian state. Of course, to ensure stability, those who represented a threat would have to be eliminated. This included Slavs, who were considered inferior, besides which they were taking up the land that the Nazis saw as additional living space for Germans in Eastern Europe. Socialists, because they, of course, were the leaders of class conflict. Gay people, because, of course, they violated the basic principles of traditional society about male-female relationships. And the handicapped, because, of course, they were unfit to be part of a superior Aryan race. And finally, and most significantly, the Jews. Why the Jews? In part because there was a long tradition in Europe of anti-Semitism. Partly because this attack provided the sort of irrationalist answer that could be satisfying to all of those people who had seen their savings evaporate, who had seen their children killed in war. Again, when I was talking earlier about the problems that afflicted Germany and how each of them could be explained in fairly rational terms, and I said, well, that's true. Nobody really wants to hear that. You know, if you open the paper one day and find out, well, my retirement account, which I thought was $500,000, just disintegrated because, you know, I had it all in Enron. You know, somebody can get on and say, well, look, you know, there's been a, you know, reduction in state regulation of corporations, so this kind of thing was bound to happen. You know, okay, fine. That's great. What am I going to do about my $500,000? Okay, it's not very satisfying. But on the other hand, if you open the paper, find out your $500,000 in Enron has just disintegrated, and somebody comes along and says, hey, you want to come with us? We're going downtown, and we're going to get Ken Lay and the other guys and drag them through the streets, beat them, and hang them by their heels. Hey, now that's satisfying. I can feel pretty good about that. You give people an emotional answer. You give them the satisfaction. These are people who are burning with anger, who are furious, who have seen their lives destroyed. They don't want to hear from an economist about what causes hyperinflation. They want an answer. Just as in any given situation where people find themselves suffering enormous loss, they want revenge. And reading an economist analyst doesn't provide you with revenge. There was another factor in the anti-Semitism as well, aside from its Western roots, the fact that it could be used as an explanation for Germany's problems, by stripping Jews of their economic resources, not only in Germany, but as Germany conquered various parts of Europe, it helped feed economic prosperity in Germany itself, as hundreds of millions of dollars poured into the German economy as Jewish-owned assets around Europe were simply stripped and sold off and became part of the German economy. So there were both deep-rooted historical reasons, reasons that had to do with the crisis in Germany itself, and explanations that were unfortunately very economically practical. Now, the other example of fascism arises in Japan, half a world away. And it's not identical, but it is very similar in one particular form. And that is, just as in Germany, Japan was a country that had modernized in the midst of a deeply repressive social system. Now, Japan was characterized by a feudal order, at the top of which was the emperor. For several centuries leading up to the 19th century, the emperor's power had been significantly diminished, and real power in the system lay with the shogun, the military leader, the military chieftain. The feudal part of the system was characterized or typified by daimyos. Daimyos were feudal lords throughout Japan. And they had their feudal retainers, the samurai warriors. And they, in turn, drew their resources from tribute payments from the peasantry. Now, the system is feudal because we do have a series of relationships here between the shogun and the daimyos, much like European princes and the various lords within their realm who had sworn their loyalty to them. It's the same kind of relationship here. However, this is a far more repressive relationship than existed in most of Europe under feudalism. There is not the understanding of a mutual contract, of mutual obligation. For example, when we looked at what happened in England in the 17th century, when the lords threw the yeomen or the peasants off the land, they were violating a mutual agreement that they had. The lord provided protection, the yeoman provided the labor to work the land. But here, there's no give and take. The stories of, samurai who would walk down the road and a peasant looked at them the wrong way, lop off their head, are not entirely exaggerations. This is a highly repressive system. And as with Germany, so too here, it was the feudal lords in the countryside who came to dominate society. Towns and the merchants who lived in them were fully subordinated to the rule of the daimyos. They did not have the kinds of freedoms that merchants had in Western urban settings. Or for that matter, merchants, let us say, in India, in urban settings. Here, the rural landlords were the controlling force. And control stretched all the way down to the lowest levels in the peasant village. Senior members of the village were individually responsible for the behavior of assigned groups within their village. In other words, if somebody's acting up in the village, there's a member of the senior peasantry who's responsible for going and getting that person and pulling them back into line. This is a system of pervasive control right down to small villages. Now, as I said, the system that prevailed for several centuries was one that was dominated by the shoguns or the military leaders. The last one was the Tokugawa shogunate, running from 1603 to 1868. And Japan, under the shoguns, had maintained itself in a sort of splendid isolation. If you look at the dates of the Tokugawa shogunate, of course, this is a time when Westerners are arriving in the Indian Ocean, in the Pacific Ocean, China, etc. The Japanese are doing their best to fend off these foreign elements. And they're doing it fairly effectively. So Japan has functioned virtually in complete isolation, even compared to China, which was not highly receptive to outsiders or Westerners coming, but even more so, Japan had isolated itself. This remained true until the American Admiral Perry arrived in 1852 with his fleet of so-called black ships. Perry had been sent by the US government to present a request for an opening up of formal relations between the United States and Japan. Of course, what the Americans really wanted was they wanted to be involved in trade with Japan, as did the British and other countries. The Americans were already heavily involved in trade with China. Japan looked like a very promising opportunity that nobody else had cracked up until now. Now, Perry came supposedly on a peaceful mission, but he came on that mission in warships. And when the shogun said, well, I got to think about this, he said, okay, I'll come back next year. In the meantime, the shogun decided that he needed to consult the daimyos, the feudal lords, about what to do. That act helped undermine the authority of the last shogun. The shoguns had been in executive control of the foreign affairs of Japan. Now a shogun was showing weakness by turning to his daimyos for advice on this very serious challenge. And the problem was the Japanese could easily see that, well, yeah, they could say no. The Americans had modern warships. The Japanese didn't have anything like that. So if you say no, are the Americans going to use force? Japanese aren't foolish. They know about the Opium War that occurred in China in 1839. Wouldn't be too hard to cook up an incident here. So how are they going to face this challenge? Because what the Americans really come back looking for is extraterritoriality, which means the Americans want to be free to operate in Japan, to bring in business interests, to trade. It isn't just a matter of formal relationships. It's at this point that two of the most important daimyos form an alliance to restore the power of the Japanese emperor and set Japan on a new course, what was known as the Meiji Restoration. What the restoration consisted of was bringing the emperor back to full power. But its implications went far beyond that. And in fact, restoring the emperor to power is a bit misleading, because what they really wanted to do was to create a modern state and society. And that's what they're about to do. They were going to dismantle the feudal institutions of the past and put modern institutions in their place. One of the steps in this direction was to begin undermining the power of the samurai, the armed retainers of the daimyos of the feudal lords. The samurai were pensioned off. They were given government pensions. Thanks for helping for the past few centuries. You can go home now and collect a pension. They were being pushed aside. Of course, you had to have something to replace them. And that something was a modern military. Creation of the modern Japanese army. And that really begins in 1873, when they begin national conscription, a national draft. So now people will be drafted from around the country to build a modern military, instead of the feudal retainers, the samurais, being the principal military force. And of course, that military will be under the control of the central government. Now, the leaders of the Meiji reform wanted a modern state, but they didn't necessarily want a democratic state. They indeed wrote a constitution in 1889. But under its terms, approximately 460,000 out of 50 million people could vote. Not a lot, even if you allow for, children and so forth. That 50 million people, that's a lot of people. Only the elite, a very small percentage, the upper edge of society, was going to be allowed to vote and run this society. This was not a democracy. It was a modern state, it had a constitution, but only the elite would run it. Now, at the same time, they did institute compulsory universal education. And you could say, well, gee, that's another step towards democracy. Well, not really. That wasn't their purpose. They were intent upon modernizing, which meant industrializing. And to industrialize, you have to have an educated population. You can't send illiterate people in to run factories. You may say, well, I know, it's not that big a deal. You pull a few levers and do this and do. Well, go into a factory. Everything's got, dials on it and numbers and signs and instructions. If you can't read or write, if you can't do basic math, you'll kill yourself. So if you're going to have an industrial economy, you have to have at least a minimal education for the population. They have to be basically literate in terms of reading and mathematics. So that was the purpose of compulsory universal education, was to speed the process of industrial development, not to encourage democracy. Indeed, the military increasingly came to dominate the new modern government of Japan. And their challenges were very much the challenges that the German Kaiser had faced. This again was still a highly repressive society. The military was used to put down peasant uprisings, to break up strikes by workers in the new industrial plants. This was a repressive system, and like Germany, had a limited internal market. As a result, this was going to be a society, again, with an aggressive foreign policy. Japan occupied Manchuria in 1931. Manchuria, part of China. The justification? Well, basically, they wanted it. The prime minister, Inoue, is assassinated in 1932, and by 1938, Japan is under full-scale military rule. Again, we have a society which has achieved modernization, but in the context of a highly repressive social system. And what that meant was that democratic outcomes were unlikely, particularly in the face of crises such as those faced by Germany. It's not to say that there couldn't have been a democratic outcome. Japan, during the 1920s, particularly the early 1920s, had a fairly liberal political regime in power. But it was soon undermined by the right-wing elements in the military. The fact is that in these societies, as they tried to modernize and face the crises that occur in modernity and face the limitations of modernizing when you have a repressed social system, a lack of internal markets, when you have anti-democratic leanings, the solution is to turn towards totalitarian government. So neither of these outcomes, of fascism in Japan or fascism in Germany, were inevitable. But the basic environment where people experience the uncertainties and the crises of modernity, as workers struggle in Japan to try to make a decent living, as they organize and strike, peasants deal with increasing taxation to fuel a modern government, and they mobilize and rebel. The answer of the state is going to be to crush them, because that is the basic anti-democratic environment in these societies. So the roots of fascism lie in environments that are hostile to democratic outcomes. Excuse me. In both Germany and Japan, their earlier history, dating back to the early modern era at least, indicated the creation of political systems that gave the power to highly conservative landowning groups who imposed highly repressive economic and social systems on their societies. In both cases, in Germany and Japan, there were alliances between these very powerful landowners and less powerful industrialists. Their solution to the crises of modernity, whether it was class conflict, the insecurities, the uncertainties of modern economies, with both inflation and depression, their solution to these challenges was internal repression. And to cope with the fact that their own internal economies had limits on growth, because so much of the population was excluded from any real participation in the economy, their solution was to be highly aggressive in the international field, helping contribute to the wars in Asia and Europe in the 1930s and 40s. So what we have are two societies that indeed achieved modernity, but did so within very repressive social systems. And when faced with the crises that afflict every modern society, the inclination was to choose anti-democratic and, more specifically, fascist solutions, to empower the state totally, to repress the population, and to seek solutions to economic problems in overseas aggression. Now, that's not to say that Germany and Japan were identical. They weren't. There were distinctions. German fascism was marked by racism and mass mobilization. Racism, we saw, the idea of the superior Aryan race, the idea of the final solution with the Jewish population, exterminating 6 million people. And we saw the process of mass mobilization in events like the Nuremberg events, the development of the Nazi Party itself, incorporating millions of people in mass marches, involvement in these public demonstrations to rally people in support of the totalitarian regime. Japan, while also a fascist state, didn't demonstrate those same characteristics. In Japan, racism internally wouldn't have made any sense. Japan's a highly homogeneous population. Yeah, there are a few groups that would qualify as minority ethnic groups, but they're tiny. So you can't possibly, there would be no inclination or reason why a totalitarian state in Japan, at least internally, would build on a racist philosophy. They might see themselves as superior, of course, to the Chinese and to other Asians, but you weren't going to rally support in Japan by saying, well, we're going after that minority, you know, those 500 people who live in northern Japan who are an ethnic minority. Oh, yeah, they're a real threat. Got to go after them. There just was no logic to it because of the ethnic homogeneity of the Japanese population. At the same time, there really wasn't the need for the mass mobilizations that typified fascism in Germany. Why? because the mechanisms of social control were already there, right down to the village level, from the time of the shogunate and even before that. In other words, there was already this system where even the village elders in every small hamlet were still held responsible for the behavior of individuals in their population. So there's no need to mobilize for social control. You already have that social control. So there are clearly distinctions between fascism in Germany and fascism in Japan that have to do with the individual histories of these two societies. And furthermore, it's important to remember that, well, these are the two striking cases of fascism in the 20th century. They are not rooted in some national character of these societies. In other words, no, it doesn't have to do with, you know how the Germans are, you know, they like to give orders and, you know, they're very neat. So, of course, they'd be fascist. No. You know, or, you know, Hitler, he was just crazy. Well, that's why it happened. That's all very appealing, I know, when you know, watch the History Channel. But that's not really why this happened. It happened because of the social and economic conditions in these societies. Once they modernized, they had very repressive social and political systems. And when they faced the crises that every modern society faced in terms of economic uncertainties and class conflict, changing gender roles, their solution was not a democratic solution that, you know, let's fight it out in Congress or something. The solution, given their past history, was more likely, as it turned out to be, a solution of repression. And of course, in the 20th century, they had at their command the enormous powers of a modern state, the modern military, modern transportation systems, modern bureaucracies that could impose total control over a society. But most of all, it's important to remember, both for the 20th century and our own age, is that fascism and other forms of totalitarianism are not the product of some distinctive national character that might typify one group of people versus another. Given the right conditions, given crises in societies, given the undermining, which can happen, of political institutions, democratic political institutions, it's possible to conceive of totalitarian solutions in almost any social and political context. So the cautionary tale of fascism is that it didn't happen here, but the truth is it could probably happen anywhere. And indeed, in the next segment, we're going to see how totalitarian solutions arise again, not in the form of fascism, but communism, as traditional authoritarian states try to rapidly push their societies into modernity, setting off all kinds of uprisings and upheavals in this rush to modernize, and leading to radical revolutions that once again lead to totalitarian regimes. Not of the same type, we're talking communist versus fascist, but nevertheless once again wind up with totalitarian answers as people try to come to grips with the enormous promise, but also the terrible challenges of modernity. We'll look at that in the second half of this session.